What's up guys, and welcome to the 2023 Mazda CX-9 Signature. I've been living with this 3-row SUV for the last few days and I've put over 450 miles on it. So I'm going to tell you what it's like to live with and whether or not I recommend it if you're looking for a 3-row SUV in the sub $50,000 price range. So this is a fully loaded Signature model with all-wheel drive and a 2.5-liter turbocharged inline-4 engine, and the MSRP of this particular car in Soul Red Crystal Metallic comes out to right around $48,000. The Signature model has the upgraded 20-inch wheels with all-season tires, this Napa leather interior, and all the bells and whistles. So as of right now, this is the largest SUV that Mazda has in its lineup. I've already reviewed the CX-30, CX-5, and CX-50. So this CX-9 rounds out the Mazda CUV lineup. So the interesting thing about the CX-9 is even though this is a 2023 model year, this generation of CX-9 has been out since 2016. So it's more or less on its last legs, and once the CX-90 comes out, I suspect the CX-9 will likely be discontinued. Now that being said, this CX-9 is still very competent in many ways. So let's talk about some of the things I really like about it. First and foremost, the exterior design and styling. There's just something so unoffensive about the way Mazda designs their cars, or at least their SUVs and CUVs. It has a simple, clean look with clean lines on the exterior. It has a sculpted silhouette. Nothing about this SUV is boxy. And that exterior design language translates into the interior as well. It's a very simplistic, yet classy and modern design. We have this 10-inch infotainment screen. It supports wired Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. Very crisp and clear and easy to read. However, you have to operate it with this rotary dial. It works okay, but in some instances, I really just wish it had a proper touchscreen. Because after all, Android Auto and Apple CarPlay are simply meant to be used with a touchscreen. The gauge cluster is really nice. It has a mixture of digital and analog gauges. The center speedometer and multifunction gauge is digital, while the two gauges on the left and right sides are analog. These Napa leather trimmed power seats are extremely comfortable. I've driven this car around 200 miles today and I don't feel fatigued at all. Rest of the interior in terms of build quality and materials is very familiar if you've been in any other modern Mazda product. Although I will say the CX-5 and this CX-9 compared to the 30 and 50 models, not in terms of build quality, but just in terms of interior design, they feel a little bit last gen. Some of the control layouts like the HVAC controls just don't feel quite as modern as the CX-30 and CX-50. After all, those cars were designed after the CX-5 and CX-9. But other than that, this interior is very nice. It feels upscale. Even for a fully loaded $48,000 car, I would argue this interior feels slightly more upscale than that price would suggest. Mechanically, this car is similar to those other CUVs and SUVs. It has the 2.5-liter turbocharged inline-4 engine. On regular 87-octane gas, it makes 227 horsepower and 310 pound-feet of torque. If you do put in 91 octane, you will get around 250 horsepower, and that torque number bumps up to 320 pound-feet. And this engine felt great in the CX-30, CX-5, and CX-50 because those cars are quite a bit lighter. They're all sub 4,000 pounds. This CX-9, since it is quite a bit longer, in fact, I think it's around 16 inches longer than the CX-5, it is a bit hefty at 4,400 pounds. So while this engine in those other CUVs felt pretty powerful, in this one, at the top end, there's really not much pull. I think 0 to 60 is rated at 9 seconds. But here's the thing, don't let those numbers fool you. Yes, this car might not be quick when you're accelerating flat out and shifting at redline, but from stoplight to stoplight, I have no issues with the acceleration that this car provides. And that's because this 2.5-liter engine has been tuned to have a vast amount of low-end torque. And you feel like you get most of, if not all of that torque, even from around 1,500 RPM. I've said this before, but the tuning of this engine makes it feel almost like a diesel turbocharged engine. And that suits the character of this car very well. You're able to get away with a lower displacement, only 4-cylinder engine in a full-sized 3-row SUV, and it feels perfectly adequate around town. Here's the downside, however. Although you have the mechanical simplicity and ease of maintenance of a 4-cylinder, you don't really get much benefit in the way of fuel economy. Like I said, I've driven this car over 450 miles, mostly just cruising around. Granted, I had 5 adults and 3 small dogs in the car with me, which probably put the total weight of this car with passengers at over probably 5,200 pounds. But even then, I was mostly just cruising at 70 miles an hour on the interstate here in Texas. And let's see, I've averaged 20.8 miles per gallon. I expected a couple MPGs higher for just a 4-cylinder engine. So that's the drawback of this engine. I would have loved to see this car come with a hybrid system, but of course that will be fixed in the upcoming CX-90, which I'll talk about a little bit later in the video. This car sits on an all-wheel drive platform. However, it is a front-wheel drive based all-wheel drive architecture. Now what that means is that this car doesn't have the most sophisticated driving dynamics. Although pretty much every vehicle in Mazda's lineup is generally touted for having excellent driving dynamics, I would say there's still quite a bit of room for improvement here. And let me explain why. This CX-9 ultimately feels like it uses an economy car architecture. So for example, going over bumps, especially above 70 miles an hour, even just expansion joints on the highway, there's a little bit of jitteriness to the suspension, and the front and rear axles don't feel like they're in sync, if that makes sense. You feel like the front suspension is moving around, but not with the same oscillation as the rear suspension. And it gives the vehicle just an overall slight sense of uneasiness. Now, this is actually a very minor complaint. At no point did I feel like this car felt dangerous to drive at high speed. But all things considered, I do feel like I'm feeling the limitations of this architecture, as I did with the CX-30, CX-5, and CX-50. As far as steering, this CX-9 has pretty direct steering. I would say definitely one of the better steering racks in this segment of SUV, but it doesn't feel as good as the steering in the CX-50. Kind of to be expected given this car weighs like 500 to 600 pounds more. We have a 6-speed torque converter automatic transmission, and while it is starting to show signs of age compared to some 8-speed units out there nowadays, in 6th gear, going over 70-75 miles an hour, the RPM stay nice and low, and because of the way this engine is tuned for low-end torque, you always feel like you have plenty of power on tap, even in the higher gears. It does have paddle shifters and they work fine, although the shifts are what you'd expect for a torque converter automatic. NVH levels are reasonable, but definitely could be a bit better. Again, my main gripe with the overall comfort of this car is the suspension, and I suspect, again, that's due to the all-wheel drive platform that this car is based on. So one of the other limitations of the CX-9, at least compared to some other 3-row SUVs, is interior space, not only for passengers, but also for cargo. This particular CX-9 is fitted with the optional 2nd-row captain's chairs, making it a 6-passenger vehicle rather than a 7-passenger. Like I said, I recently had 5 adults and 3 dogs crammed into the CX-9, and while it was doable, there were some very noticeable limitations. 1st row, obviously, and 2nd row comfort and space are totally adequate. Actually, the 2nd row is quite comfortable, but the 3rd row is definitely limited, not only in terms of legroom, which I think is actually reasonable, but headroom is definitely going to be a problem if you're close to 6 feet tall. Obviously, you can fold the 3rd row down, but with it up, the trunk has very little usable space. And that's going to be your most likely issue with the CX-9 if you're really looking for a comfortable 3-row SUV. It is definitely one of the smaller ones out there in terms of interior space. And I think that's in part due to the exterior styling of this SUV. The focus on a sleek, curvaceous exterior silhouette means that the CX-9 might not be as practical as you think. In terms of comfort, this fully loaded CX-9 has heated and cooled seats, 3-stage for each, dual zone climate control in the front. In the rear, there's adjustable climate control for the 2nd row, which then has to extend into the 3rd row. So it is a little tricky getting the car cooled properly if you do have someone in the third row. This has the pretty typical suite of Mazda driver aids. It has adaptive cruise control with lane keep assist, although this lane keep assist system does seem to get flustered quite easily. In fact, I decided to turn it off. It does have front and rear cameras, as well as a 360-degree camera, but overall, the suite of tech that you get in this car is starting to feel a little bit last gen. And so that's where the upcoming CX-90 could potentially be a game changer. I don't get excited about SUVs very often, but that's one that I'm actually legitimately stoked to review. It's going to be physically larger than the CX-9. It should be a lot more comfortable, especially in the third row. And maybe even more importantly, for me at least, is it's going to have an all-new engine and all-wheel drive architecture. It's going to offer a longitudinally mounted inline-six turbocharged engine. Obviously, the 4-cylinder in the CX-9 is transversely mounted. And what that means is the all-wheel drive platform of the CX-90 will be rear drive based, which should theoretically give it far better driving dynamics. It should have better ride quality, it should have better handling, potentially better steering feel. Supposedly they'll start in the $40,000 range, but obviously you put a few options and you're well into the 50s. If I'm doing my math right, that should be less than $10,000 more than this CX-9. That's not to take much away from the CX-9. Let me just be clear, despite my gripes with this car, it does everything well. It just doesn't do anything great. Whereas I love the CX-50, and to a lesser extent the CX-30, the CX-9 just leaves a little bit to be desired. I think extending the wheelbase out and keeping this front drive based all-wheel drive platform definitely makes the CX-9 feel a little bit more compromised compared to its smaller siblings. I'd be curious to see how this stacks up against the 3-row Toyota Highlander. Given that the current generation Highlander is quite a bit newer than the CX-9, I think a CX-90 versus Highlander comparison would be a lot more appropriate. So that being said, would I recommend purchasing a brand new CX-9? It should come as no surprise that my answer is probably not, because the CX-90 is just around the corner. Yes, you're probably going to spend a bit more for the same trim level, but at least you'll be getting an all-new architecture with an all-new engine and a hybrid system. More space, more practicality, more tech, and in my opinion, even better exterior design. So conclusion, the CX-9, despite being on its last legs, is still a very well-rounded 3-row SUV. So a big thank you to Mazda for providing me with the CX-9 for a week. Let me know how you think the CX-9 compares to some of the newer 3-row SUVs out there. As always, thank you for watching. Please subscribe if you have not already, and I'll see you in the next video.